All right, guys, we're going to try this a different way. It sounds like a lot of you have had a really hard time getting a copy of the book. Come to find out that the school or the school's campus bookstore has been sending wrong copies. So I figure if I record the lecture, it might be a little bit easier. Give me some feedback on this and let me know if this is helpful as we move forward. But we're going to keep in mind as we're talking about the colonies, we tend to want to link them together because they are kind of popping up around the same time and they do eventually become states. But at this point, we really have to keep them completely separated in our minds because they are in no way linked together. So just kind of recapping from last week, those who were settling in the Chesapeake area were mostly poor, very short-lived indentured servants. Chesapeake and Jamestown were established for completely different reasons than the northern colonies. And we're going to look in this lecture a little bit at what some of those reasons were. The main difference is you need to get the concept between what is the difference between a Puritan and the Pilgrims. Puritans believed that faith was based on the individual, so like a religious reform. Pilgrims believed the same, but they felt that England was too corrupt to ever be fixed. So they wanted complete and total separation. So you're looking at, with the Pilgrims, you're very much looking at a political reform. So when we look at New England in particular, who were they? The people who were going to the New England regions were primarily men and women who could pay their own passage across the Atlantic. They're not wealthy, they're not poor, but they'd probably be considered middle class today. If not all were Puritans, they were all intent on purifying the Protestant faith. So for background, we're looking, okay, the English church, and we're going to dive back some, 1400s here. Henry VIII. You've got to understand that Henry VIII, the church had, England has gone for 200 years here back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism from the time of Henry VIII. He wants to separate from the Catholic Church due to the fact he wants divorce. He likes having many different wives, so he breaks away and he establishes the Anglican Church in order to have that divorce so he can marry someone to have an heir to the throne. In other words, the crown used the Anglican Church to promote political as well as religious conformity. So the Puritan beliefs, the English church was too much of a tangled web of Catholic and Protestant rituals and beliefs. So if we look at the hierarchy with that, with the church, the difference is your Catholic Church is going to have the Pope at the top. Whereas whenever you go to the Anglican Church, you're looking at the king at the top. And the problem is the Pilgrims really are, and your Puritans are going to want a lot more reform. And the Pilgrims believe that it is too far gone to get any reform out of the system. So the Puritans as a whole divide over exactly how the change should occur. Some will choose to stay within the church and others will choose to be what's called a separatist. So they want to completely separate from that church. So you can say all pilgrims are Puritans, but not all Puritans are pilgrims. So your Puritans want to recapture the purity of the original church of Jesus and his disciples. And they urge every believer to seek God by reading the Bible. So they a lot of times will form prayer groups, they heed the preaching of the ministers. And so what they're looking for things to say, okay, what really is the problem that's going on in England? And one of the problems with what we see here with a lot of people by saying that they need to read the Bible, one of the problems that we see is most people couldn't read the Bible. not all people during this time period are literate, and as a matter of fact, very few people are literate. So they want to help kind of spread the knowledge and things like that around. So and so also think, they're just blatantly coming out and saying that the King of England is wrong in his Anglican beliefs. And if the king is wrong, then what does it make these people? So they're basically seen as being heretics. Um, the Puritans also have a very strong work ethic. They believe that God had complete power over grace and salvation. And they could tell who was saved in part by their work ethic. So if a person were lazy, then they did not believe that that person was a believer in God. They were doers, since the diligence and the discipline honored God. Puritans labored even harder to protect their morality. And so therefore it was all kind of a cycle. You had to work hard. You had to worship hard. You had to try your hardest to be perfect. So Puritans also will very much reinforce the values of thrift, of things like diligence and delayed gratification. And they believed that those were all things that were essentially part of what you had to be a well-rounded person, to have notions of well-being. So the Puritans felt that England was dominated by thieves, drunks, idlers, blasphemers, but they thought that England could be cleansed if the righteous were put in places of leadership, like the churches and in local governments. Whereas the Pilgrims are going to believe that England is too far, it's just all too far gone. Okay. So English rulers were very, very leery of this Puritan movement that's going on. By 1604, King James stated that if the Puritans did not conform to his authority, he would chase them out of England. Yet he allowed the Puritans to persist without too much trouble. The problem is when his son, King Charles II, ascends to the throne in 1625. And so where James was a little more, whatever, I'll leave you alone. King Charles I and his appointed leaders enforced the Anglican policy, and they did start persecuting the Puritans. So the Pilgrims, they left England around in 1608, and they moved to Holland. So a lot of times we look at the Pilgrims and think that they immediately came to the United States, and they didn't. They first went to Holland. It was not very stable. They did receive, because it was so unstable there, they did receive a land grant from Virginia to settle there. And so they leave Holland in 1620. 102 separatists who sailed on the Mayflower, they kind of landed a little too far north of where they had been given land. So, had they landed in Virginia, things might have been a little bit easier, to begin with. But instead they end up around Plymouth, and they received a royal charter since they had no claim over the land there. There was an equal number of men and women, which this is different. So if you remember from reading about Jamestown last week, you have a lot more men there than women. And we kind of touched on that a couple weeks ago in your, kind of forward thinking thing with Pocahontas, that men were looking toward the natives sometimes for marriage. But what we do see at Plymouth is we see an equal number of men and women. And what they hope to find religious freedom. And I want you to think about religious freedom not in the terms of everyone has the freedom to worship and believe whatever religion they want. That's not the kind of religious freedom we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the freedom to practice their religion. They will be very close-minded to other religions. But as far as their own religion, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a way to have their own religious freedom. They want to establish their own independent government. And they arrived shortly after an epidemic had just absolutely devastated the local Indian communities. So they found an abandoned village, and conveniently all the fields were cleared. So of course they look at this as a divine intervention from God. God provided this land for them, and so therefore they were supposed to be there. Did they understand there had been an epidemic that had wiped this entire village out? Most likely no. But they believe that God has cleared this path for them. And so their first winter is incredibly difficult. They had good crops the following year. They really did have a great work ethic in comparison to what we saw in Jamestown's early years, where it was hard to get anybody to work. So the Plymouth colony ended up having about 1,500 people by 1630, and they remained separated from England until 1691 because they just felt that there was no hope. Now the Puritans, if we look at the Puritans, we're going to look at the Puritans, honestly, in the next video. I'm going to try to break this down into smaller chunks so that you can sit and listen. Maybe if you've got, an hour in class, in class that you're taking at school, you can sit and listen to this for 15 minutes, go through the PowerPoints, take you some notes and look at it. And so I'm going to upload these videos in several different installments. So we'll pick up with the Puritans on the next one. So, but right now, remember, all Pilgrims are Puritans, but not all Puritans are Pilgrims. And that's the big thing to take away from this. Your Pilgrims are separatists, whereas on average, your Puritans are going to feel that they can possibly reform England. But your Pilgrims want to be completely separate. All right. Let me know if this helps.